All right, everybody. Today, your boy is solo, and I kind of want to just jump in on like some real practical stuff as it pertains to training. So, traditionally, most people are familiar with adding weight, adding reps, adding sets, trying to take away rest time, adding, I think I already said adding weight, but you get the point. It's pick an exercise and it's progressively overload it, and that is it. Just do that to no end. And so, we can talk about things as it pertains to long-term progressions and how you might go about doing that, whether it's linear or if we're wave loading or daily undulating or something like that. That all is going to be less important than what I'm about to mention. And that is that we're actually setting ourselves up for success in the long run by making sure that we are moving properly. And so, what does that look like? So, a lot of people, when they begin exercising, they, let's say, are doing an exercise like a squat. They have no idea why they're doing it, aside from the fact that they think it trains their legs and that they've seen other people say that this is such a great exercise to do. And I'm not saying that it's not, but we have to make sure that we pick the right squat for us. And how will we do that? So we might have some passive, which would mean just like without any assistance from yourself, like you pulling yourself into position. Passively, how far can your joints go into space? So like, can we pull your knee to your chest? Could, if we pulled your knee to about 90 degrees, just over your pelvis, if we could rotate the leg in and out, that's testing internal and external rotation. How far can you go? Can you get 45 degrees of internal rotation, which would be kind of rotating that heel out? And can you get about 90 degrees rotating in? Awesome. Can you get 90 degrees of hip flexions? Basically, if we lifted your leg straight up to stretch your hamstring, like if we pulled it towards your face, are we actually getting 90 degrees of hip flexion there? And then how well are we able to extend the hip? We do what's called a Thomas test. Feel free to look that one up on YouTube. But let's say we go through all that. We're like, okay, maybe there's a mild restriction there. No big deal. Nothing that should keep us from performing a squat, but just something to note. And then we go and we test, let's say your split squat. And you're doing split squats, and you notice, like, man, this feels really shaky. Feels really unstable, if you will. And we've already noticed that there's not really a range of motion restriction there. Nothing notable. And we're kind of wondering why you feel so unstable. Well, it's not linked to stiffness in this case. So it's literally just our ability to control that position. So if we just went off of the reps, sets, weight model of progressing this, we would just have you do more reps of it. The thing is the quality of those reps is low because you're not likely to stay in those unstable positions because they're uncomfortable, and it's far easier to just jump out of them. So a lot of times you'll see people descend into the bottom of this split squat or lunge, whatever you're more familiar with. They descended to the bottom of that very quickly, and then they just bounce right back out. Okay. And a lot of the positive benefits from that exercise are going to be gained from getting to that deep, unstable position and controlling it, and then kind of feeling what it's like to produce force, but also not have that force throw you totally off balance, which is going to require moving more slowly. So, the first thing that I would say is finding ranges that we have access to that we can then begin to stabilize is a form of progression. And so what we would look at this as a form of skill acquisition. So you're understanding the position and you're able to safely place tension onto the muscles and then produce force from there. That's going to be a sign of progression. Now, how would we quantify that? We'd look at that as what is labeled as tempo. So when we look at tempo, we're like, okay, how much time did we spend to come down? This would be called the eccentric. So, or the lowering phase. Now, this would depend on the exercise, because some exercises, the eccentric is they start at different points. Like sometimes it's the beginning of the exercise, and sometimes it's the end. So, for a squat, you unrack it, and then you go into the eccentric. So the first thing you do is go down. So it's the lowering phase. Whereas at deadlift, you're picking it up first, which is the concentric phase, and then you're lowering slowly. So just important to note that when we are going through that eccentric phase, that is when we're kind of yielding and we're trying to stabilize and place tension on the muscle. And then the concentric phase, which is when we're pushing, is where we're producing force. And we want to make sure that that force is applied appropriately. So, and an indicator for some people would be, am I experiencing pain somewhere other than the muscle? Like I'm noticing it in a joint, or what would feel like maybe connective tissue. It's like the area just above the kneecap, but it's not the kneecap, but it's clearly not a muscle, kind of feels tendony there. So making sure that we're placing force appropriately, or if you're feeling it like quote unquote inside of a joint, that would be a sign that we're not placing tension on the muscles that we're hoping to train. And so a lot of times, what ends up happening is people are in a rush to speed up not only the exercise, but progression. And so they add more and more weight. And this might mean that they end up cutting off the range of motion of that exercise. So now they're not getting as deep as they were before. This is problematic because now we're not affecting all of the tissue that we hope to train or stimulate the growth or just stimulate like what we would need from an athletic standpoint, like in terms of the depth or stretch required to get into certain positions. That's no longer going to be there if we're cutting off range of motion perpetually just in an effort to increase loads. So I would say it's never more important to add load than to maintain range of motion. If you can't add weight and keep the same range of motion, you just weren't ready to go up yet. So that would be my first thing. So we've got tempo where we're controlling this motion, and then we've got the range of motion that we're actually trying to maintain. And now let's say if you don't have what somebody would deem is the adequate range of motion. So this is going to be based on what your body physically has the capacity to do and can be improved over time, but then also what is going to benefit you based on your goal. And so if you are somebody who likes to run or hike, greater and greater degrees of depth in a split squat could be useful, but it also might not be crazy in terms of like how much you would notice it in your day-to-day. Now, you would also improve, your ability to stabilize that joint a little bit better, which is going to carry over into, running as a byproduct, but not necessarily due to specifically being in a deep stretched position, just more to doing that exercise. So, you like a lot of people have probably seen LeBron James do his squat, and it was like a quarter squat, and people are like, oh, well, like it wasn't deep enough or whatever. But the dude's contract is an astronomical amount of money, and the trainer probably doesn't want to be the one responsible for potentially injuring him. And it was deep enough. He doesn't find himself in much deeper a squat position in the game of basketball. So it doesn't necessarily pay dividends to do that. Now, if his goal was to grow his quads as large as possible or get his glutes more toned or something like that, then yeah, he'd probably want to be squatting a little bit deeper or, performing exercises with more depth. But in terms of its athletic carryover, there probably wasn't much there for him in terms of risk reward. Not to say that he couldn't train deeper and also maybe potentially experience some benefits there, but yeah, I think with the heavy weight of the price tag of his contract, the it makes it a lot easier to make a decision that is conservative in that case because he still plays at a high level. So now for you, you would just have to determine like, okay, well, what are all the things that I am interested in improving in exercise? And if it's tissue quality, if it is being able to get into greater depths, being more mobile, then that is something that we're going to want to progress first before progressing load. So instead of just adding more weight and shortening the range of motion that you're training, keep the same range of motion at least, or improve the range of motion before increasing the load. Okay, so we've got our tempo, which is going to benefit our stability. We've got our range of motion, and these are all things that aren't necessarily the sets reps weight that we talked about in terms of traditional progression. So looking at how long each rep takes. So if it took 3 seconds to come down, you did a 1 second pause, you did 2 seconds to come up. That's a 5 second rep. And if you're doing that times 8 reps, you've got about 40 seconds there. So you've got 40 seconds of time that we can now quantify if you're actually staying true to the actual tempo. So 40 seconds tempo, just doing split squats. Great. And now let's say you added some weight and the tempo stayed the same. You know you added an extreme, you added a large form of progress there. Now, how you don't need to turn it into a number in terms of like the amount of force produced or the volume. The volume is going to be dictated by your sets, reps, and weight, but like it's just something to keep into account when we're trying to track progress with the movement. Like adherence to tempo, like improving your tempo, is a sign of progression. So if weights don't go up, but you had a better adherence to tempo, I would say that is progress. Now there are some exercises that aren't split squats that are more externally stable, like machines. These ones, we're probably going to, as long as we maintain range of motion, we're probably going to be okay with just progressing the sets and the reps. Now, do we want to elicit a good tempo to ensure that we're keeping tension on the right things? Yes. But because it is more externally stable and we're less likely to deviate out of position just due to the nature of the machine, yeah, you can probably you can use that one to build up a little bit more strength while we're trying to find good stability and depth in our other exercises. So let's say I was working on a goblet squat because I wanted to improve my position so that I could keep my core in a good position while loading into a squat pattern. So a lot of people, they will break between their rib cage and their pelvis, where their rib cage goes up and the pelvis goes forward, and so now the diaphragm isn't aimed against the pelvic floor. You can't create good intra-abdominal pressure because it can't. It literally is pressing out against your stomach instead of down against the pelvic floor. And so that's not a position you want to be in if you were to like load into a back squat. So if there's a bar on your back, then there would be more, you'd have more compressive force on your back versus if you were able to maintain that trunk alignment. That's why somebody, they might benefit more from being in a goblet squat first before progressing to maybe a front squat to progressing to a high bar squat. It also has to do with your ability to be able to externally rotate your shoulders, being able to get your hands and elbows in a good position with the bar on your back. If you don't have that, and we're just trying to get you to back squat and your elbows are pointing straight back at the wall, and we're not able to get the appropriate, tension through our upper back or position our trunk appropriately, then yeah, sure, you'll be able to get more weight on the bar and you might be pushing, but you're also likely to experience plateau, and that is hard to work through, and you end up having to take steps back to fix that. Versus if you work from the goblet up, you're probably only going to see progress from that point forward, so long as we're focusing on keeping those things in good position. And I would say that this is also true of other exercises. And I know that this may just be more confusing for some people because they're like, oh, I just thought this was a progression and that was a progression. They are, but there are things that we want to pay attention to in terms of what is happening at our shoulders, hips, and spine, so that we know how and when it's safe to progress and what needs to be worked on. So some people might have a hard time stabilizing their shoulders. So instead of starting them with an overhead press, which is commonly written in some beginner programs, I wouldn't recommend it. Being that from my experience, I have not seen many beginners who walk into the gym who have adequate upper back strength, strength in the rotator cuff, strength in the lower traps, strength in the serratus, to start at an exercise like overhead press. And so I would probably be more likely to start that person in a landmine shoulder press, which is basically kind of almost like a 45-degree incline bench press. So if you were to angle up a bench so that it was at 45 degrees, and then you decided to do some pressing from that position, it would be similar to that, except you have a barbell in a corner and you're just picking that up off the ground, and then you're kind of pushing it out in front of you. So it's slightly lower than a 45 degree, but that's another way that we could progress it, moving from that to maybe a lunge type position to moving to a half kneeling position, so that as you go lower down, the bar goes higher up, and that increases the amount of shoulder flexion over time as you're gaining more control in that position. So this is how I go about progressing my clients, and some might determine it a health phase or a general preparation phase, but I'm literally just trying to get them to see results on maybe on the machines that's going to help quote unquote tone their muscles, because they're building more muscle, they're probably experiencing some fat loss, and they're seeing strength gains on those, while we're trying to build the skill of the exercise through some of our accessory movements, or some of our other exercise selection. And then we're going to marry those two together as they become more advanced and more skilled in those positions. And then we're going to see hey, I can actually really tolerate some pretty heavy loads, and on some pretty cool movements. Some people swear deadlifts are bad for your back. And I would say that for most people, it might be. And the only reason I would say that is because most people that walk into the gym, who meet with a trainer for the first time, who are introduced to a barbell deadlift on the first day, don't have the requisite strength in their lats to do a conventional barbell deadlift off of the floor. So they don't have the range of motion, first of all, in their hamstrings, to get down into that position, and then safely load their lower back without the assistance of the lats, because if you can't externally rotate your shoulder and maintain that position and keep it into depression, you're not getting you're not getting the lat tie-in into the thoracolumbar fascia, which is basically the fascia of your lower back. And when the lats pull on those, it creates tension, which makes it safer to load, right? But if there's slack in the system, then your spine takes the hit. And so, yeah, for most people, just coming into the gym might not be a good idea. And some people will jump people onto the trap bar right away. And I'd say, even though it is a more vertically oriented option and your erectors will take less of a hit and it would be more of your upper back, you still run the risk, depending on how heavy the bar is, how much you're loading it, And if you didn't have the requisite lat strength, or your trainer didn't introduce you to that, and you're noticing that you're patterning extension a bit more, people have a tendency, if they don't have the core strength required to get to the top of that movement, to put pressure onto the joint facets, which is essentially like little mini vertebrae off to the side. It's like you have the spine, the spinous process, which shoots straight off the back of your vertebrae, and then the little ones off to the sides, kind of, I don't, they kind of fan out in like this V shape off the side of the vertebra. And as you get more and more into the lower back, like the lumbar spine, there's this little cushy type, almost like disky tissue, there called the joint facets. And when you just load the spine instead, like you're loading the spine as structure instead of loading the muscles into the lift, you're going to put pressure on those joint facets, and that is not going to feel good. So, yeah, even trap bar deadlift might not be a good option when you first get started. Some people just need to learn how to pattern the hinge with a rope and a cable, and they do what's called a rope hinge. Lots of people can start with a Romanian deadlift with dumbbells, not with a barbell. Just, again, due to the fact that the barbell being off in front of you, versus when you start with the dumbbells, you can move them a bit more to your side. They're less likely to have a longer lever on the spine, which limits how much the erectors are going to be involved there. But also, because your dumbbells are more off to your sides, you're more externally rotated, you're more likely to get tension onto your lats. Whereas when the bar is in front of you, you're more internally rotated and you get less tension on your lats. I know this was a lot. I know I'm kind of going off on a little tangent here, but there's a lot of things to consider in the long run when we're looking at developing our programs, not just from a progression standpoint, but from a longevity and health standpoint, how we're going to set up for blocks of continued success, and actually making sure that we're getting, like, we're making a straight line of progress, where some people try to take a shortcut. They pick exercises and positions that they shouldn't necessarily be in. They don't have the strength to be in. And I'll say firsthand, I've walked into commercial gyms and I've seen, young men in their 20s just barbell back squatting. They don't even know if they're doing a high bar or a low bar. They just have the bar somewhere on their back. And based on whichever position you need to be in, you need to be angled a certain way. And so somebody might have the bar in a low bar position, but they're doing a high bar squat. And that's going to feel weird just because the weight is not in the right spot on your back to stay completely upright. Like if you leaned a little bit more forward, then you probably feel a little bit better. And if you leaned a little bit more forward and you got a little bit more back into your hips, that would probably feel a little bit better because you'd be able to keep your weight over your midfoot. But in order to keep your weight over your midfoot, when the bar is that low on your back, you have to send your chest so far forward that it just feels like you're on your toes. And then you can't get any depth, and you're wondering why. You think your calves are tight, and then you're rolling your calves, and that wasn't even the problem. Yeah. So there's a lot going on here, and I want to break it all down in detail over the course of the podcast. I'll work to put out YouTube videos to link to these. Again, lots of stuff going on with training that, yeah, if you're just trying to be active and you want to get moving, there's probably like a list of great start exercises for most people. I'd say, like, hey, a lot of people getting your heels slightly elevated, like putting them on like a 10 pound plate and then doing some goblet squats. Great place for some people to start. A lot of people aren't there. They might need to start with some counterbalance squats where you take like a 10 pound plate and you just kind of push it out in front of you, like reach your arms long, and then you squat from there, and you get to stay more upright, and you just focus on keeping your core nice and tight. But it varies from person to person. So sometimes it's helpful to to see people in person and assess that. I do a lot of my work online as well. So clients sending me videos so I can tell them, hey, like this is what we need to do, or here's how I would go about progressing that. But in terms of knowing if you are in the right position or not, sometimes it's just going to be like reaching out to somebody and finding out if it does look okay, and it does look safe. So yeah, if you have questions, I'd say like reach out to me on Instagram. I'm at the _ Mr. MISTER _ Davis. I also have it linked to the show notes, so that shouldn't be too hard to find. But also, you can email me, steven@davisfitnessmethod.com. If you have any questions about your form and technique, I'm happy to answer. You don't have to be a client of mine. I just want to see us all do better. I want to see people get fit without frustration. And like I was frustrated with my progress early on, not knowing what to do, having to spend countless hours on the internet, and then through, formal education and continued education, I was able to get the answers. And I don't think all of you need to do that. And I'm happy to help you cut the line. You're not going to be able to cut the line by yourself by just putting a barbell on your back. And you can learn the hard way, but that's not cutting in line. You can cut in line by asking questions from people that have done it before you. So I'm here if you need anything. Thanks for listening. I know it was a long 26 minutes, but I appreciate you being here. And I'll see you on the next one.